Well, again, everybody, thank you very much for coming. We'll go ahead and get started. We'll give one more minute for people to log in. We're now up to 20 people on, so that's great. I want to give them a couple more minutes for them to join in with us. So we'll give one more minute for folks to do that as they may not be dialing in, and we'll get started momentarily. Well, with that, I'm not seeing any other additional logins, so let's go ahead and begin. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. I am Professor Erik Backus. I am a faculty member at Clarkson University in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I am going to be facilitating this conversation this afternoon about the community, and we want to hear from you about your thoughts about what's been going on. To kind of get you started, what we're trying to understand from you in this session, and it was an earlier session this week on Tuesday where we really listened to you and tried to hear from you ahead of the sessions, and that information was publicly made available by ANCA going into some working sessions over the last couple of days. But today I want to do is do a quick summary, and Jared Bly is here from ANCA, who is a key coordinator behind the scenes on creating the ANCA on-ramp Clean Transportation Summit. Give you a quick summary of what went on in the work sessions, and several of you have been very active and members, as I've myself, in the overall summit, listening to several different people bring forward ideas and approaches to this topic. But we want to go beyond just thinking about the near term and getting into the future. So without further ado, I'm going to start the session talking about what we heard this week, and Jared may chime in as needed to kind of give us some key points. So the first thing that really is our catalyst for this conversation has been the World University Games, the FISU World University Games that are going to be happening and centered around Lake Placid, but not exclusively Lake Placid, as you see in the image to the right, in the 2023, January 2023 timeframe, as you see on the slide. There are lots of things that are going to be needed to make that event successful, to make that event that's going to be on the world stage, make the region shine. And one of the big questions is what is the future with regards to how we're going to use this as a tool to not just worry about the 2023 games. That's certainly the short term or near term event that we need to be thinking about. But beyond that, what is this going to do to help us propel forward? We start thinking about transportation needs broadly, but specific to the summit has been discussions around clean transportation. And we'll get into some of those ideas that were presented this week so you have some sense of what that is. But again, while thinking about the catalyst that is the World Games, which is a big driver, it's not the only driver. As a matter of fact, for the long term, it's not what is being thought about. How can we make this be something that moves into the future for where we want to go as a region? So the first was discussion around vehicles. So we had several different speakers across the spectrum of vehicle opportunity, different ways to think about vehicles. All the way from the bottom right in the slide, we started simply talking about electric vehicles and what is the density of electric vehicles. If you look at that chart on the bottom right on the slide, you'll see that the North Country drastically trails behind the rest of the state in terms of EV adoption on the part of people across the North Country. And the same thing with long distance vehicles or load vehicles, so vans that are in the area, well below what would be there. But certainly the idea of electric vehicles that would be available for certainly the individual commuter or driver are a part of it. But we thought there was a lot more discussion about other kinds of ways to get around. One in the top left, of course, is the vans. What are the ways you could have low density deliveries and things of that nature be done? This example is from Amazon, their Prime fleet that they're developing. On the upper right then is what about thinking about electric buses? and thinking about that electric bus as a mechanism to electrify and create a cleaner transportation. So as you're driving down the highway, you're no longer emitting, but you're using bus. And those buses, could they be part of not just merely a pool used dedicated for the games, but maybe thinking about that, or local transportation? Could they be part of what the school districts are thinking about in terms of their bus fleet as that moves forward? And not just specifically Lake Placid Central School District, maybe broader and other neighboring school districts. Can we think about that as part of this? And looking at the energy costs and how that relates to the long-term cost of busing, which is a huge part of what we do for secondary education here in New York State. And then you can see beyond thinking about busing and delivery is in the bottom left is a picture of a kind of a scale of where things might be going in terms of thinking about long-term, medium freight or long haul, heavy freight opportunities, and so forth that could be available, thinking about larger vehicles that would be electrified, how they would potentially be part of this picture, and what the services might be needed for those vehicles if we think about them going in the future. What was really interesting beyond just talking about the options for vehicles was talking about the North Country's history in developing transportation vehicle options. And so this slide came out of our friends over in Plattsburgh, where they talked about where they've gone from Bombardier in its establishment in '95, all the way through looking at North Titanium and what they've been doing, and how we have, as a region, been a leader in development of new vehicle fleet and new vehicle technologies throughout time. What is the next part of what this picture might be? And so in thinking about vehicles and developing them, could we also think about this in terms of jobs and economic drivers to create these fleet vehicles, whether they be for long haul freight or be for local delivery or be for the bus fleets that we're thinking about here potentially? And then thinking about the incentives and what are the ways to get these vehicles on the road potentially within this. So when we get into it, we're going to ask some questions. What do you think about these vehicle ideas? What do they mean to you? How's that? Is that getting juices flowing about possibilities and about challenges that might arise out of thinking about this? Jared, is there anything I missed in regards to vehicles from the working session on that?
You did a pretty good job covering the full spectrum of the different categories and possibilities and options that are currently available right
Jared, we're not hearing you very well.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you better now.
Okay. I was just saying, I think you did a fine job covering the different classifications and different types of vehicles, the whole spectrum that is available right now. At least that was covered, that which was covered in the content from the working group. So I'd say you could continue on at this point.
Great, thank you, Jared. So again, I'm reflecting on what I heard, so I appreciate having the facilitator here today. So moving on from the vehicles was the question about how do we charge all these vehicles? A big question is, what does that look like? Again, looking at, from a EV charging perspective, if I'm a person trying to visit the area as a tourist or just to get around as a member of the community here, what's the EV charging landscape look like? To the top right, you can see how many EVs are currently on the road, how many electric vehicles are currently on the road today, and where are the charging stations. And you can see the sparseness of just general charging stations, level 2 or higher, as well as the DC, direct current fast charge ports that are fairly limited within the area. And how's that look? And then an example of one of those charging stations in Evolve, New York charging stations is an example from NYSERDA, who they shared with us what this program has been doing. So how do we do this, and how do we address the just electric and compared to the DC fast? And you can see the difference in these two maps of what that landscape looks like, especially across here in the North Country, and how that might work. And then what is the right business model to enable charging? This slide bottom from our friends at ChargePoint, who provided some thoughts about what are the different models and what are the different users of charging, and what are their needs, and how do we think through what might be the charging infrastructure that needs to be in place to enable that to be put forward. And so, one example was put forward by some Canadian partners, saying, hey, they looked at, on the left is a pathway that gets you from Montreal, Laval, Quebec, up to Mont Tremblant. And if you've not been to Mont Tremblant, it's a very lovely winter destination. And how they've created a corridor of charging infrastructure that allows people to get from Montreal to Mont Tremblant very effectively. When you compare that to getting from Montreal to Lake Placid, you see the very stark difference in the image here. And the words kind of paint a picture. And so how do we think about developing and planning where these charging station locations are, and what is the infrastructure in place for charging that we need to think about putting in place to enable us, and what the density might be? And there's an example here that we could compare against from our friends in Quebec. So broadly speaking, those were the kind of discussion points on charging I caught. Jared, was there anything else that I might have missed on the charging discussion?
So I'll just echo what Kevin George Miller from ChargePoint, he kind of highlighted that to consider EV ready requirements for new and retrofit construction to reduce future need for program incentives. So, you know, as a staff, we've been kind of compiling all of our notes and distilling the content from those presentations. And Kevin really brought up some good points that the main cost of installing installing the EVSE really is on the labor side, and the capital cost for the equipment is kind of minimal compared to everything else that needs to happen either on the customer side or the utility side. And so creating programs and making sure that you can reduce those costs will really help deploy these in a way that people can get on board with. And really from his presentation, I think that was the main point that I pulled out. I feel like you did a pretty good job covering what Travis Allen from Flow at Energy also was talking about, and most of the New York programs that Rebecca from NIPA discussed. So
Great.
yeah, I think we're pretty good for this point, or at this point, but we do have some other ANCA staff that is on the call right now, and I would welcome their participation if they had anything that they felt was important to pull out or to pick up at this point in the conversation.
Yeah, I do see Jennifer and Nancy, of course, that are on as well.
Well, I'll just add that we have a lot that we're summarizing for Monday, and so I'm not sure I caught everything that you said, because I'm thinking about our presentation for Monday, but I did hear a lot of the main points. Thanks.
Yeah, right. And here we're trying just to give a quick highlights, just so some sense of this for the community to kind of react to. So thank you for that, Nancy. Just a reminder, there will be a Monday kind of full outbrief that will be given much more detail on each of these sessions for sure.
This is Jen, and my responsibility was working group 1. So the again, excellent summary. Actually, I'm mining from you, so I apologize, but this is really helpful for us. But the one relevant piece of information from the vehicle point of view is that the timeline is of concern from the University Games perspective. That it's really important for them to really be jumping on this now. That some of these larger vehicles can take a long time to acquire, and there's a lot more to consider that I was aware of, including the maintenance aspects, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so otherwise, this is great and helpful. Thank you.
Great, great. So let me move on then to the last segment, last working session that we had, and that was dealing with the grid. So obviously the vehicles are one thing, the charging locations and having that service capacity is great. We got to be able to get the power to it. And how does the grid able to do that? The top left is a slide that kind of illustrates the current breakdown of the Lake Placid municipal power. So if you're not familiar, Lake Placid, I think many of you are, Lake Placid is a separate municipal provider of power, thanks to a long-standing agreement to provide that power. And you can see the breakup today where it's going, residential and obviously the commercial work, and then Orta creating as a 15% of their current sales. Adding in EVs or electric vehicles into this mix and thinking about that, how does that going to do that? And is there a capacity there to be able to do that? And right now, there's the existing transmission, but creating additional transmission to the community is just not really feasible. So how do we think about providing the capacity we need? And so, one of the things is looking at, in a slide in the bottom to the right here is from our friends at National Grid, thinking about the way we plan and think about where we're going to go with the grid and how we need to think about what's the demand requirements for this. By demand, meaning that time when we're providing, need to provide power. So for those that may not be familiar about the grid, but we plan for continuous operation. So you're able to turn the light switch on, the light will be on. And that means even when it's 2 p.m. on the hottest day in August or July, and all the air conditioners are running, we have the ability to provide that power to you by our grid operators and by our producers of that power. And so building that capacity to meet that demand is really a challenge, especially we now add on the charging of electric vehicles. What does that look like for the grid? And so there's a lot of things that need to go into that. It's what is the programs that make that available? What is the fleet going to look like? And then what is the effect both at a residential location and in commercial locations, and how that gets built into the grid is a key part of this. And then thinking about what are the levels of investment that need to be thought about? What is the cost for the stations, but also the backbone that allows for that to come forward? This being provided as a way to think about how you might think about investments in different types of things, in different ways that, in this case, there's financing that might be available to support the installation of these, but also supporting the broader grid development and supporting that. And then thinking about what would this look like in terms of the overall goals of the state. The goal has the state has a very aggressive set of goals to get to reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. How is this tracking with that, and are we going to be able to do that while having a grid? Ideas like microgrids came up. Ideas like additional localized power supply had been brought up. But then how do you integrate that within a grid structure to make that work? So it's not just for the games, which may be a specific intense event, as you saw some of those earlier slides. A lot of people will be coming to town, needing it all at once. But then beyond that, thinking about how does that work for the region going forward beyond 2023? Are we going to be ready? And is there going to be the resources available to make that work? With this, Jared, anything else that was talked about on the grid side yesterday that not touched on?
Well, I just thought it was fascinating that, at least speaking for Lake Placid, they hit, their peak is in the winter compared to the rest of the nation. For the most part, that peaks, in the summertime with air conditioning loads. And that's, kind of narrowing down the scope of this to the game. How would the peak on the grid in Lake Placid affect charging that may be needed to support the games, during that 2-week period in 2023? But also that's, when range for vehicles is probably least because of the draw from the cold weather. And so how does the allocation to Lake Placid's municipal electric, like how will that all come together? It seems like it could be a scenario for a perfect storm, and it probably warrants a little bit of thought on, what needs to happen in order to avoid that.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback on what Jared just said. Two of the most interesting pieces of that conversation for me were similar to what we're talking about with net metering in terms of the pending upgrades that are going to be required from the grid as the capacity rapidly ramps up, that who's going to pay for those upgrades. And Kimball really poignantly brought that up very specifically. Kimball, being the head of the Lake Placid Municipal Electric, is they're going to need to make some changes in who's going to pay. They don't get a lot of income, so that's a really big piece of the conversation from the grid. And also a really interesting is the rate structures and how they're going to need to accommodate EV charging better than they do right now. And that's happening on the Department of Public Service scale and level. So that those are two really big, interesting parts of the conversation that are happening, but really curious to see where they go in the future, especially as it pertains to the municipal electric.
Yeah, and I would echo the other part of that too, in terms of rate structure and in terms of the changes, because they're a separate municipal provider. They do not fit into the NYSERDA fund, and as a consequence, they're not eligible for several different grant programs that would be for other providers because of the way that the structure that is. So that also puts additional stress into resources in order to enable the grid locally to be able to sufficient to be able to make all this work. So that's another great point, Jennifer. Thank you on that. Any last things from the ANCA staff? I'd like to move on and get us into, since we're now a good ways into this, with the balance of time, really get to the thoughts of the public. And so really what we want to do now is, you've heard a little about what the ideas were, some of the issues discussed, some of the things that we hit on over the last couple of days with the working sessions. This is really to turn that now back to you as the public and say, are we right about these things? What do you think about what we're talking about here? What do you know that we don't know about this idea of clean transportation, or broadly about transportation and what's going on with that we need to bring to the fore in this? And so I've got a series of 3 questions that I'm going to put forward to the group, and we're going to allow you to kind of provide us some thoughts and feedback on what you just heard, and then related to those questions. And beyond that, if there's things that just, you want to challenge us on, you want to tell us, give us some things, we want to hear from you, because we think we know where we're going. We've heard some things, we've been talking about it, but we've been doing it sometimes within a lot of the structure of technical experts and people that know the region well, granted, but we want to kind of hear from your perspective. And so with that, we have really 3 questions we're going to drive through. What do you think? What do you hear? What are your impressions about what we just told you? So the first question here is, what do you hear in the ideas that just kind of came out of the summit that we've been talking about here so far over this period of time, that make the most sense to you? What resonates? What fits? What's the right fit? And are there any of these that you're thinking about? And I'd love to hear from people in the public. What do you think makes sense out of these ideas that we just presented to you, coming out of the working groups? So if you will, please unmute yourself. Please identify yourself if you're willing to do so, or if you don't want to be identified. Again, we are recording this session. Please, say, hey, I don't want you to be identified, but give us some indication of maybe the organization or relationship to the community that you have. So again, please feel free to unmute yourself at this time if you have some thoughts about, what about these ideas that we presented about vehicles, charging, or the grid, or other things that we've been talking about here that resonate with you. Go ahead, Mo. Yeah, please, you should be able to unmute yourself, so please do. So Mo, I think I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say hello, everybody. It's been I learned a lot. I've been following all this so far, and I've just love to be part of it. It's a lot of learning, and I would like to, I don't have much question at the moment, but definitely I will reach out.
Daniel, did you have something you wanted to say, sir?
Yeah, I have a lot of things I want to say, but Jennifer is quite right. Is this schedule has got to be very aggressive. I've been a power system engineer for 40 years. I've worked in the rail industry, the vehicle supplier industry, and there are a lot of things that were identified that have to be done: funding, procurement, even small backup power. Even emergency services. These vehicles, when they get in an accident, could provide a different scenario for emergency crews. You've got the batteries there. So I think you identified some problems, a lot of the issues, but boy, it's pretty aggressive. 2023, it's I better start getting work on it.
Okay.
Right away. I mean, there were a lot of problems, as anybody recalls, at the 1980 Olympics with transportation and electric delivery. And so I hope that that's not being repeated. But at least they're identified now. But then you have to implement all these ideas. So.
Are there maybe?
I agree.
Go ahead, Lori.
with that. I agree with that it's super aggressive, and it also and perhaps I'm missing something, but it's all about electric vehicles. And I think that there are other less ambitious things that we talked about that could help, or alternatives to having more vehicles on the road, right? So, sidewalks, walkability, even when you're in town, more vehicles on the road within the village of Lake Placid doesn't matter whether they're clean or dirty. It's a nightmare. So, I do think it's aggressive. There are the big questions that always exist is how in God's name are we paying for all of this? Because the citizens of Lake Placid and the North Country certainly aren't going to want to.
Which brings up a good question. Of these ideas, which are there particular ones we should prioritize towards the top? To that point, should we think less about individual vehicles and more about, hey, the bus fleet, because that would be replacing things within existing bus fleets that are there, that would make sense to do that instead of, so is there any level of, from your perspectives, priorities or which are better than others that were thrown out as ideas?
I mean, I would argue that, buses and vehicles that hold more people are better than smaller vehicles. But again, that covers the idea of regional transportation, but not necessarily transportation within the local communities.
I mean, it really doesn't depend if you use buses or what. If your streets are jammed out, buses won't move just as well as cars won't move. So I don't know.
So maybe I should flip to the next question, because my next question is, what did you hear this week that is just a non-starter? This is all wonderful discussion points, but is there something that that just will not work, that just doesn't seem to make any sense as part of this discussion of where we're going in the future in transportation for the games or beyond?
I mean, and just speaking from the Lake Placid perspective, adding more vehicles without taking some other type of vehicles away, I don't know where it all fits.
Got it.
So, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a non-starter, but somebody's got to be thinking that through. And if these charging stations are going to take up parking places, where are we making up that piece of it? I just don't know.
Okay.
I'd like to piggyback a little on what Lori said. I'm Diane Fox. I'm the superintendent of schools in Saranac Lake. Coming late, but thank you for the invite to this conversation. It's difficult to answer your questions, Eric, when I don't really know what the overall transportation plan is. Is the idea that there will be large parking areas and people will have to take public transportation? So without sort of understanding what the people movement is going to look like, it's hard to weigh in and help you out with answering your questions as to what type of vehicles we want, because spending a lot of time not only here in Saranac Lake on a busy Saturday, but Lake Placid too, really it's what your entire plan has that would help us decide then on what type of vehicles we would need to make it work.
True, and I think so that really begs the question of thinking about the larger picture of transportation, because this is a big event, but we have other events, in the region. I'm just thinking about the lovely winter festival that goes on Lake Flower in Saranac Lake, or the Ironman competitions that happen in Lake Placid, lacrosse tournament, other things, the big canoe activities that go on through the summer as well. So maybe stepping back from these ideas, the question is, what are the key questions we need to answer first? Are we getting too far ahead of the picture here in thinking about specifically clean transportation when we have some other broader questions to answer? And I'd like to hear maybe your thoughts about that.
I think that Diane's point is well taken. If we don't have an overall, I'm guessing you probably do, we're just not aware of it, have an overall transportation plan, both for FISU, but also beyond. I mean, what are we trying to accomplish? What are our goals here? I mean, obviously moving people, but how, you know, what are we doing to make things better and not necessarily worse?
Okay, yeah.
Well, there is
Okay, yeah.
there is a transportation plan for the games being developed, and how people, spectators and athletes and officials will be moved throughout the 2-week period. So that is being developed and was presented to, you know, the presenters of some of these sessions earlier. It probably hasn't gotten down to everybody yet, and it's not finalized, I don't believe.
And no, it's still being developed. I think that's the key thing. It's in
Sure.
progress. So that's an important, and that they presented because they did that earlier on the Tuesday session.
Yeah, I think it's important to just take a step back and note that there haven't been any hard commitments identified or targets even identified as far as replacing X number of internal combustion vehicles with electric vehicles or other alternative fuel vehicles. It's still very early in the planning phase of this, but the whole point of this summit, really, from my perspective, was to get the conversation going now with you all, with the community members, both in Lake Placid, Saranac Lake, and the region, to help establish some of those targets and to identify what the concerns may be. Because, you know, the possibility is there may not be any electric vehicles. There may be no penetration as far as like what is replaced. But the idea is to start the conversation now so that we can work toward that. I mean, as things stand now, everything to support the games, to move people, to move equipment is going to be through internal combustion vehicles. And so to lay the groundwork now with the summit and discussions that surround it for this event, for future events, and for a regional planning consideration, is really comes down to this: public feedback, hearing from folks, and, you know, several people have pointed out, well, what's the overall plan? There isn't, as far as I've been able to deduce, there is no overall plan that is in motion at this point. It's still very early in the planning phase for the games. So Eric, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about regional plan, but I think it's important to come at it from that perspective and just kind of make a note of that.
I mean, there is a unit management plan that has been developed for certain portions of the park, and that's out there. But I, in terms of the specifics for the games, I think that plan is, as I said, is being developed. There were just some identifications of how many people need to be where. That's kind of where they've started from. There's a chart that when the slides come out, you'll see kind of laying out some of those things. But there's not been a, hey, this parking lot's going to be this and that parking lot's going to be that, or this route's going to be without, you know, we're going to divert vehicles here. None of that is even on the table yet. Daniel, I think you wanted to say something. So before we go any further, I think you had unmuted yourself, so I don't want to.
Yeah, I think you already covered some of it. Well, one thing I want to say, I don't know, was there ever any consideration of just closing the road, letting buses through part of Lake Placid in the parking lots on the periphery? I've been going to Lake Placid, Saranac Lake for probably 40, 50 years, and you know, I sort of see the problems there. But I think having a transportation professional should look at the short term and long term is essential. Consultant. So that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Is there any other voices that want to chime in on this question? We'll move to the last question, I think, which will actually get into, I think, a broader discussion point. And I think, Laura, you actually started us on this a little bit ago, is, you know, given where you're coming from, you know, related to mobility and housing and all the aspects of community in this region, you know, what ideas do you have about transportation. You know, we've got some ideas here that came out of the summit that were very focused, as Lori, you indicated, you know, the focus was on quote unquote clean transportation. So that's obviously non-combustion engine, but there's a lot of other aspects of transportation. And we'd really like to kind of hear, you know, what are some ideas that you had? Now, obviously, for those that participated in the Tuesday session earlier this week, we had some conversations around this very question as in some breakout groups, but some new people are a part of this conversation today. So I'd really like to kind of hear from them or maybe some other things that maybe come up based upon this earlier part of the conversation that may change some of the things that came from Tuesday. So I kind of want to explore this more. What are some things we could be doing from your perspective? What are the visions that you have? What are the challenges, certainly, but what also is available here that's unique, that maybe not been really discussed really well up to this point, or maybe there's something that's been generated as we've been talking about these things for the last several days as a group.
Eric, I'm just jumping in. Monique asks, what role might the town of Keene play? So how do, and more broadly, I expect we could probably ask the question, how do some of the smaller outlier towns, the not Lake Placid, the not Saranac Lake, but some of the other smaller towns play into this kind of thinking and planning? And that's probably a question for anybody to answer.
Is there any thoughts on that? That's a great question. Is there any thoughts on that? Thank you, Monique. Do you want to share more about that, Monique? I don't know if you're still on. Yes, she is. You know, if she wanted to.
We had a Keene Clean Energy team. It was a volunteers. It became a de facto energy department for the town because the town has virtually no personnel to take on things. And our team helped get grants, and they got charging stations, among others, and solarizing the town buildings. Where they can go from there, I don't know. Keene's right in the middle of high peaks, and we get swamped now in the summers, in the hiking season. What would happen in January of 2023? How can the town be part of it and accommodate huge numbers of people? Parking, especially. I assume, I had another question too. What role can a small non-environmental group play? But presumably it's the town of Keene that has to be very much involved as an entity.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I talked about on Tuesday is the idea of sort of a spoke and hub kind of concept, where you really, for communities Lake Placid, Saranac Lake, you've got to get some of the cars out, or encourage them to not come in. So to Diane's point is creating some sort of a, outside parking lots that kind of quote unquote forces people to take public transportation into the central hubs. Otherwise, people are going to do what's simplest, and they're going to take their car. But then that will just create a logjam. So having places like Keene and Wilmington and places out toward the west where we could find areas to put parking and encourage the use of public transportation on the way in could, even in the future, provide mechanisms for those who work in Lake Placid and Saranac Lake and come from places like Malone or further out to the west, a place where they could park a car, get on the bus, and get to work with ease and reliability. But I think you've got to figure out how to keep the cars out from the outset.
Is there one idea was put forward? Pete Nelson at one point was having electric cars go to the train station, bring people to the exit 29, where there's developing a hub for hikers. And from there you would have shuttle buses carrying people up. That's farther out. And the other thing about Van Hovenberg, maybe have enough regular clients. I don't know how much room would be at Van Hovenberg as a place for people to park to take a transportation in shuttles.
I think the to your earlier question about what can a small municipality like Keene play is certainly engaging in a conversation about what are the possibilities, what are the points of restriction and challenge. And so what you just kind of identified was, the trail hub issue that has been noted very well and very publicly. And then making sure it's clear, what the thoughts are that is. So you brought up Mount Van Hopenberg, certainly brought up the idea of the exit 29. I was not as aware of that they're working on that as well.
And actually, it was an idea.
Mm-hmm. So, what are those ideas, and then how do we develop that going forward? So these are great questions. Any other questions or thoughts about this broader transportation challenge?
I think it's really important to remember that clean transportation and in particular electrification of transportation is happening, and it's happening maybe less in the US than some other countries, as in Canada and Europe, but it's coming here, and New York State has huge goals to decarbonize our transportation. And so how can we in the North Country make sure it comes here too? Like, we're not the last ones to get it, like we are in other technologies, but how can we make sure it comes here now? And that was the whole, the whole premise behind, wanting to use the World University Games to push it, to get it to come here, now. And because it is here already. There's a lot of EVs being driven around Lake Placid, and that's why Tesla put in 8 supercharge stations, DC fast charge stations, in the Price Chopper parking lot last month. They're here. They put them there to bring them here, and they're here, and that's why they put them here. So it's coming, and being ready for it and taking advantage of it. All the benefits of electrified transportation is something that we need to jump on.
Nancy, you're very aware that Keene, you were involved with it. Keene got 2 charging stations. I don't have an electric car now, but as I look ahead and think I might get one, I don't think that's enough for me and any large number of people with electric cars. So some people have their private chargers at their own homes, but one way would just make sure there are more chargers and eventually a fast charger in Keene available. It's that chicken and egg you were talking about early on in this program.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point. What's the first part? Is it the infrastructure or the vehicle, or is it's got to be brought together in some way? So that's a great point. Mo, I think you had something you wanted to say, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on, we're talking about Exit 29, which I'm actually developing that Exit 29 A-frame building. I have plenty of room, and to add on even bus charges and future, even make it a hub. Plus, any use could be used for future plannings. So just wanting to hear any kind of ideas that could be used for future. There's no concrete information I have anything that anybody is going to do make a hub at Exit 29.
Erik, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, I can. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I was on mute. Apparently that whole time, I don't know what was going on, but my name is Emma Lamy. I work for ORDA, and ORDA is going to play, a huge part in these games in terms of our facilities and, getting people around. And there are definitely plans for Mount Van Hopenberg to become a hub, not only for, the games, but for hiking, and getting people off of 73 and dealing with that crowding situation. So I think that, where was I going with that? Oh, okay, yes. Monique, have you heard of the High Peaks Advisory Group?
Yes, well, I know of it. I haven't been involved with it.
Okay, so that's something that Joe P. and I are actually part of. I'm not sure if there's anyone else on this call. I've seen some people participating, which has been really nice, but they're working to kind of do a pilot shuttle program and, pick hubs along 73.
Yeah.
And I believe their interim report is online if you wanted to read it. It's got a lot of really good information about, you know, their goals and stuff like that. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I think there was some idea of expanding parking at Marcy Field with the shuttles coming there.
Right. Dysfunction Junction.
That's what I thought it was, but
Okay, thank you.
So any other thoughts on this on this trend of thought? Thinking about specifically, it sounds like kind of what happened south and east of town with Keene, and the whole trails aspect along 73. Anything else? Any thoughts around that, or other areas? Again, please. What do you have any thoughts? I appreciate them.
Yeah, Eric, let's go on the other side, of course, and you probably know what I'm going to say. The western side. In 2022, the railroad will be coming to Tupper Lake. Unfortunately, the section from Tupper to Placid is being dismantled. I see it as a hub for perhaps electric car rentals, so that riders could proceed to Lake Placid, Saranac Lake with charging stations, or electric buses. And also the buses could be used for the Wild Center, take people to the Tupper Lake motels, lodging, so forth. But I think we shouldn't ignore it. I mean, the train is very energy efficient. Could be converted to batteries. Could be totally electric. Of course, that would require an investment, but it's possible. But let's not forget that. I mean, we're sort of punishing, I think, people who don't drive cars and who want to get to Lake Placid, Saranac Lake from the west, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Utica, Mohawk Valley area. And this section of railroad was taken out, forcing people to drive up. That's just a little comment on my part. I have to sneak that in. But so I envision it as, you know, just a very environmental way to get up the Adirondacks. It can't be there for the games, but I'm looking at after the games.
Well, I think it's a broader question of regional access. So I wouldn't even say it's just the west. You know, I think north, south, east, and west, right? That regional access is something to be thinking about here. What does that start looking like in the future? Obviously, there's certain contemporaneous things, as you mentioned, that are affecting some options that may or may not be available, and so forth. But I think maybe that's where we have to be creative, thinking about what are alternatives to what have been thought of before, getting out of the box from what we've normally done in different ways. So thank you for that. Other thoughts, and again, certainly getting to Saranac Lake from Lake Placid, it's really I hear Saranac Lake is the capital of the Adirondacks. Some people may dispute that sometimes, but certainly Lake Placid and Saranac Lake have this relationship that's been in place for several years. Is there ways to strengthen that in some way as we think westward, and all the way to Tupper Lake, as was mentioned with Daniel very recently. Other thoughts?
Eric, I'd like to just pose another question to the folks that are on the call. So was there any myths or concerns that you may have had before you were able to join some of the working group sessions that were addressed or overcome over the last few days? Did you learn anything about the technology, whether it was through the vehicles or the charging or the infrastructure side of things, that put your mind at ease, or did it actually give you more concern on any of those aspects?
I think that's certainly a good question especially maybe as we get into Monday, as you hear the recap, to think about for sure. Was there something, again, and that was kind of the earlier questions, is, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. It's also a little bit about, what did you learn that was new that either created more stress or relieved stress. It's a good set of questions, for sure. Well, we're coming up near the end, and let me kind of bring us to the next step here and where we're going with this. So, as you know, the ANCA will be continuing the summit through Monday. The final session is Monday morning. You can certainly take part in that. Definitely want to thank you for your time spent with us today to kind of give us more feedback on what we've heard, and then to emphasize some points that you felt were important. So thank you for those things. One thing that you should be aware of is that following this is Clarkson University, and that's why we're part of this, is submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation to do a transportation-related pilot project. And the first part of that would be to do a planning effort. And we submitted a proposal to get funding for that planning effort. Presuming we're successful, we should hear back at the end of this month. We are now in October. I should say that. Couldn't say that on Tuesday night. We would, if we hear back on that, we'll be launching into a planning study period from November through the March timeframe, where we'll be really discussing this. So all this input that you're giving us now, while ANCA had the clean transportation focus that they're looking at, and that certainly we appreciate your thoughts about that. Some of these issues that Lori were bringing up and others have brought up about where we're going in a larger picture will be part of that study, because we want to understand what would be something to do. If once we're done with the study, the planning phase, if presuming we do that, and that's our hope is to do, we really want to do that, would be submitting for a $1 million grant opportunity to pay for that pilot, whatever that might end up being. And we've got some great ideas of what that could be. We've got a great team. You're seeing some of those things on the slide of who's participating in this. Lots of great partners to be able to part of this, and we really want to understand that greater picture, which can certainly be influencing the 2023 plan. I think that's part of it. How do we look at events and what we do with that for transportation, and where does that look in the future for the New York Olympic region and beyond? So just a reminder again, on Monday from 9:30 to 11 is the final session for the ANCA On-Ramp Summit. This is the remaining event that we have left. We'll get a summary of both this session as well as a Tuesday session we did for community sessions, and then all the working group sessions will be part of that on Monday with a final keynote and kind of give you a closeout of what went on with this summit. I think it's been a very successful summit in that regard. Before I finish out in the last 5 minutes, are there any final thoughts or comments from anyone in the audience this afternoon?
I would just add one thing, Eric, on Monday, and I think this is a significant part of what Monday, besides kind of being report outs from each of the working group sessions that we had this past week, is we're going to be spending a significant amount of time on the local benefit, discussing how can, incorporating clean transportation at the games, bring long-term local benefit to the community. And so I think it should be a really robust conversation, and how can we benefit from it all?
Thank you, Nancy. Anything else? Well, I know some of you may still need to eat lunch. I still do. Try to figure that out. And hopefully you've been munching along. If some people have been going on and off camera, maybe you've been taking advantage of that. Please enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and please have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again so much for being with us. Standing by, if you have questions, please email us. It's ebackus@clarkson.edu. So E as in Eric, Backus, B-A-C-K-U-S @clarkson.edu. Be glad to get any other input you might have, and we can get other feedback and so forth from the session. So thanks again. Have a great day and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you and everyone who participated. This was awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Mm.